this center cap. If you have to, you can use a straight blade screwdriver. Just put a rag on the wheel so you don't scratch the wheel. Pull that cover off. Use a 21mm socket. Remove the lug nuts. Remove the wheel. I'm going to take the caliper bracket bolts out with the caliper. I'll take it all out as one assembly. Take a 22mm socket. Take these two bolts out. Right, take those bolts out. And I'm just going to take a straight blade screwdriver, just get in between the caliper and the rotor, and just try to loosen up the caliper a little bit by compressing the piston or pistons. And you should be able to slide the whole caliper assembly out, and then take a caliper hanger, slide it in here, and hook it onto the coil spring. That way you don't put any tension on the brake caliper hose. I want to pull this cap off. I'm just going to use a pry bar and a hammer. You can use a punch or a screwdriver. Just pop it off. Just like that. If there's grease on here, you can just wipe it off. There is a snap ring right here. I'm going to take that snap ring off using snap ring pliers. Slide that off. Now this is just a personal preference. I like to put stuff back together the way it came apart. I'm just going to take a marker and just mark this cap along with the hub. And then when I put this back together, line that back up. I'm going to take a 13mm socket and remove these 6 nuts on the cap. Now I'm going to take this cap off. If it's stuck on there, just use a hammer. Give it a tap. Or you can use a pry bar. Just try not to pry in between, but if you see a little corner right here, you just pry there. Just try to wiggle that, get that loose, take it off. There's 2 screws right there and right there. Just use a Phillips head screwdriver, take these screws out. Now I'm going to take a pick. I'm going to take this piece off right here. This is like a lock or a keyway that prevents the hub from loosening up. There it is keyed right there and right there. So set that aside. Now there is a special tool to remove this or to tighten it, but you generally can just use a pick to loosen it up. Just keep in mind that the rotor could fall. Pull this off and you can grab the rotor. And it's still on there pretty tight. Oh, there's the old bearing. Take that out. All right, now I can slide this whole hub off. I don't want to damage the reluctor wheel, so I'm going to take 2 pieces of wood, space them apart, flip the rotor over, just like that. I'm just going to take a socket that fits in there, use a dead blow hammer, and just tap out the bearing, and that's going to tap the seal out. Just like that. There's the bearing, and there's the seal. It's a good idea to replace this seal, but sometimes if it looks okay, you can reuse it. Now I can flip this over with the studs facing down. I'm just going to put it on that wood so I don't damage the studs. Take a rag, you can wipe as much of this grease out as possible. Right, there's 2 notches. There's one right here and one on this side. And what I want to do is take a punch and a hammer, and I'm just going to push out the race, the bearing race. This is the bearing race for the front bearing. Just give it a couple taps, evenly going back and forth. Try to go straight down with it. Try not to go at an angle. There we go, it's out. What you want to check is make sure you didn't cause any burrs right here in this area. So I'm just going to take a little bit of emery cloth and sand it down, or some sandpaper. Just sand down those edges. Now I'll take the new race off the bearing. Just compare it to the old race, make sure it looks the same size, which it looks good. I'll slide this in position right there. I'm going to take a bearing installer, one that fits. You don't want it to be too big. If it's too big on the race, then it's not going to go all the way down. So just slide that in position, hit it with a hammer. Make sure your wood is spread out so that you don't ruin that reluctor wheel on the other side. Generally, when you're tapping it, you'll get a different sound, and then you know it's all the way down. You can double check from the other side, or just try to see the gap right there. Just make sure. And ours looks really good. If you're doing the other race, you're going to do the same thing. Just pop the race out from this side and then press it in from the back side. So now we got the race in, the race is all set. Now we need to grease up the bearing. You can't just put the bearing in, because otherwise, this being dry, when you go down the road, it's just going to burn out and seize up. So there's a couple ways you can pack these. If you have a special tool for packing, you can use that, or you can just use your hands, use some gloves, take some grease, and you take the bearing and you're just going to fold into the grease. As you do this, you're going to start to see grease coming out on the inside of the bearing, right in there. So just keep doing that. This is how to manually do it. It just takes a lot of time. And then just spin the bearing, and just go all the way around the bearing. You can see the grease popping through right there, right there. That's perfect. And then we just move over and pack it some more. So this bearing's packed completely all the way around. Just take some other grease, put it on the outside of the bearing. And then I'm going to do the same to the other bearing, whether you're replacing the bearing or just repacking them. All right, so this bearing's all packed. Just take some extra grease. I did clean this out a little bit. Put some new grease in there. All right, that's good. Put that bearing in there. Make sure it rolls good. Take the new seal. And I like to use a piece of wood. You can use a seal installer, but wood works pretty good. And just give it a tap with a hammer. And we can take it, slide it back on the knuckle. There we go. Take the greased bearing from the front, or the packed bearing. Get that lined up. Next we'll take this axle nut. You can clean it up a little bit. And it's good to use an axle socket. You'll probably get one similar to this. It probably has smaller dimples in it, but something similar to this. I want to spin the rotor while I'm tightening this nut down. That way the bearing will tighten down evenly. All right, what we need to do is tighten this nut down to 60 foot-pounds. I just like to keep spinning it while I do that. And then you're going to spin it in both directions, forward and backwards. So this is basically just setting the bearing, setting the preload on the bearing. That just gets the bearing where it needs to be. So what I'm going to do is take a breaker bar. I'm just going to loosen this up. And you want 0 torque on this. Let's give a couple spins. Now we're going to go back with a inch-pounds torque wrench. Tighten this to 13 inch-pounds. And give it a couple spins. That's pretty good. And then recheck it. That's good. Now we can take this, this is basically a lock that's going to lock that nut from spinning. Position this right there, and you can take the 2 screws that you took out of there. Try to screw those in right there and right there. If they don't line up, you can take this plate off, flip it around, or if you have to move the lock nut, you can move it 15 degrees in either direction. I found 2 holes that are going to line up, so I'll tighten these down. Snug these down with a Phillips head screwdriver. Now we're going to put this plate back on. There is an O-ring right there. You can replace that. It's probably a good idea. I'm just going to use a little bit of grease, put a little grease on it so it seals up good. Slide this back in position, same way I took it off. Put these nuts back on. I'll just take a pry bar to prevent the hub from spinning, and I'm going to torque these nuts to 23 foot-pounds. I'm going to do it across from each other so it tightens down evenly. Reinstall the snap ring. Make sure it's in the groove. Looks good. If you have a socket that fits over this cap perfectly, use a socket and give it a tap with a hammer. It's good. Before we put the brakes on, if you got any grease on the rotors, it's a good idea to wipe the rotor down, spray some brake parts cleaner on there. Do the same on the back side. Now we can take the caliper off the bracket, off the hanger, and line the caliper over the rotor. Take the bolts, install the bolts. All right, now I'm going to use the 22mm socket, tighten these bolts down to 130 foot-pounds. If you have a Nissan Pathfinder that's older than a 1998, those bolts are going to be 72 foot-pounds. Now I'll put the wheel back on. Put the lug nuts on. I'm going to use a torque wrench and torque the lug nuts down to 100 foot-pounds in a star pattern. I want to do it in a star pattern to torque the wheel down evenly. Just go around again, double check. And I can put the center cap back on.